Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
We've noticed a lot of you are tuning in, which is amazing, but I haven't quite hit that subscribe button yet.
Yeah, and that little button, honestly, it's so small, but it makes such a huge difference in helping us reach more people with these important discussions.
Right. And today, we're embarking on, a really fascinating intellectual journey, the kind that might just shift how you see things.
We're diving into a pretty rich conversation today. It's a philosophical dialogue, really, between Madhyamaka Buddhism,
Specifically, Chandrakirti's interpretation.
that's right, Chandrakirti's Madhyamaka and Advaita Vedanta. We're looking at how they see the self, an ultimate reality.
Ideas that sound maybe abstract, but they really touch the core of our experience, don't they?
Absolutely. Deep stuff.
And what makes this deep dive, I think, particularly interesting is the source material. It's rooted in an essay by Swami Sarvapriyananda.
Oh, right. The one that started as his term paper.
Yeah, exactly. Back in 2019, he was a Nagral Fellow at Harvard Divinity School. Took this apparently very tough course on Indo-Tibetan Madhyamaka.
Taught by Professor J.L. Garfield, wasn't it?
That's the one. And get this, Professor Garfield apparently made Swami rewrite the paper 3 times.
3 times. Wow.
Yeah, telling him, and I love this quote, "This isn't a temple talk. Argue both sides with logic."
No pressure then, but that's fantastic. It means the piece was really put through its paces, logically speaking.
Totally. Forced to really grapple with both sides, not just present one view. That rigorous process, that's what shaped the piece we're digging into.
And that essay, it got published in the Vedanta Kesari early 2023, I think?
Yep.
And now it's actually the final chapter of Swami's upcoming book, Fullness and Emptiness, Vedanta and Buddhism, due out in 2025.
So what we've got here is something refined through some serious academic back and forth, aiming for a really balanced, logical comparison.
Exactly what we like for a deep dive. We're aiming to get to the heart of these profound philosophical systems.
Right. We're not just, scratching the surface. We're going deep into these fundamental questions. What's real? Who are we? So whether you've thought about this stuff before or it's all new.
Hopefully there'll be some valuable takeaways.
Definitely. Okay, let's get into it. Let's start with Madhyamaka Buddhism and this idea of the emptiness of the self.
Okay. So the core idea in Madhyamaka, especially Chandrakirti's version, is that all phenomena, and that means everything, you, me, this conversation. Everything. It's all empty of what they call inherent existence.
Okay, empty. That word can sound a bit negative, like nothing exists.
Right, and that's a crucial distinction. It's not nihilism. It doesn't mean things don't exist at all. It means they lack a fixed, independent, unchanging essence. Everything arises dependently.
Dependently. So things exist, but only in relation to other things.
Precisely. Nothing stands alone, inherently real by itself.
And Chandrakirti, he was building on Nagarjuna's work. What was his specific contribution?
Chandrakirti was really key in clarifying and defending this Madhyamaka view. His main text, the Madhyamaka Avatara, is incredibly detailed, super rigorous.
What does it do exactly?
It systematically picks apart our usual understanding of the self, the Pudgala, they call it, and also all other phenomena, the dharmas.
Deconstructing them, basically.
Yeah, showing that neither our inner feeling of I, nor the things in the external world actually hold up under analysis as having some kind of solid, independent core.
It sounds like this isn't just intellectual gymnastics, though. There's a purpose behind figuring this out.
Oh, absolutely. A deeply compassionate one. The whole point of understanding emptiness in Madhyamaka is to free all sentient beings from suffering.
And the suffering comes from
our mistaken belief in a permanent independent self. And because we believe in that, we cling to this idea of I and mine.
which then fuels all the negative stuff, greed, anger, jealousy.
Exactly, all the afflictions. So seeing through that illusion, understanding emptiness, is seen as the key to liberation. The antidote, if you will.
And later, Tsongkhapa came along and sort of synthesized things.
Yes. Tsongkhapa, a major figure in Tibetan Buddhism, he laid out what he saw as the essential components for enlightenment. He stressed 3 main things.
Okay, what are they?
First, you need bodhicitta, the altruistic mind genuinely wanting to help all beings. Second, you need the wisdom realizing emptiness, that deep insight we're talking about.
And third.
Third, realizing that emptiness doesn't mean conventional reality disappears. Things still function, cause and effect still work. Emptiness and conventional reality aren't contradictory.
Ah, okay. So it's not like realizing emptiness means you can suddenly walk through walls.
Yeah, no, exactly. Conventional reality still holds. These three, altruism, wisdom of emptiness, and understanding conventional reality, are seen as the interconnected pillars of the path.
So just to summarize the Madhyamaka view on suffering, it all stems from this fundamental mistake, this belief in a solid, independent self.
That's the root. They see this basic misunderstanding, this ignorance, as the source of pretty much all our problems, all faults and afflictions. Grasping emptiness cuts that root.
Okay, now Chandrakirti uses a famous analogy to really drive this home, the chariot. Can you unpack that for us?
Yes, the chariot analogy. It's classic. In his Madhyamaka verses 120 to 150, he uses this sevenfold reasoning. It's a step-by-step analysis to show a chariot doesn't have inherent existence.
7 steps. Okay, let's walk through them. What's the first way a chariot might inherently exist, according to the analysis?
Okay, first possibility. Is the chariot the same as its parts? The wheels, axle, frame, etc.?
And the answer is?
No, because if it were identical, then, say, breaking a wheel would mean the entire chariot is destroyed, right? Or you'd have as many chariots as there are parts. Doesn't work.
Okay, that makes sense. What's number 2?
Second, is the chariot completely different from or separate from its parts?
Like some kind of chariot ghost floating above the parts.
Kind of, yeah. And again, no, if it were totally separate, you couldn't point to the wheels or axle and say, that's part of the chariot. It seems intrinsically linked to its components.
Right, not separate. Okay, third point.
Third, does the chariot possess its parts like you possess a phone? Is it an owner of its parts? No, again, the parts constitute the chariot. They aren't just external objects it happens to own.
Okay, fourth possibility.
Fourth, do the parts subsist in the chariot? Like, is the chariot a container holding the parts?
Like marbles in a jar.
Exactly. And no, the chariot doesn't pre-exist the parts for them to be put into. It comes into being through their arrangement.
Got it. Parts don't go in the chariot.
Okay.
And number 5.
Fifth, is the chariot simply the collection or the sum total of its parts?
Like just a pile of wheels and wood.
Right, but a heap of unassembled parts isn't a chariot, is it? You need the arrangement, the structure, the function.
True. A kid isn't the finished product. What's number 6?
Sixth, is the chariot just the shape or the specific arrangement of those parts?
That seems closer.
It's closer, but still no, because the shape depends on the parts being there. A blueprint, the shape on paper, isn't a functional chariot. The shape relies on the substance of the parts.
Okay, the shape isn't enough on its own, so what's the 7th and final point?
Seventh, and this is the conclusion, the chariot doesn't have any inherent self, any independent essence apart from its aggregated parts, arranged in that specific way.
Wow. Okay, so after eliminating all those possibilities.
The conclusion is that the chariot is ultimately unfindable as an inherently existing thing. It exists conventionally as a designation.
So the big parallel here, just like the chariot is a label we put on assembled parts, the self, our sense of I, is also just a label, a designation we apply to our own collection of components.
Exactly. The components being the skandhas in Buddhism form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, consciousness.
And understanding this, really getting it, is what undermines that ego clinging.
Precisely. It pulls the rug out from under the belief in a fixed, independent I that we're so attached to. The chariot is real in a practical sense, you can ride in it, but analyze it deeply, and you can't pin down an inherent chariotness. Same goes for the self. It exists conventionally, functions in the world, but lacks that ultimate independent reality. Okay, but I can see how people might push back on that. Saying the self is just a conventional label. It sounds like it could cause problems. The text mentions 5 objections.
Yeah, Chandrakirti anticipates these. They're pretty common sense objections, actually.
What's the first one?
First is redundancy. If the self is just the aggregates, why even have the word self? Why not just talk about the aggregates? Second, the absurdity of multiple selves. If the self is just a mental label we put on the aggregates, couldn't we just decide to label multiple different selves onto the same body and mind? Seems weird.
Yeah. Third objection. This sounds like a big one.
It is. It's about karma. If there's no enduring, continuous self, who gets the results of actions? If I do something good today, but the me tomorrow isn't inherently the same me, how does karmic cause and effect work?
Right. And related to that, the fourth one.
Memory. How can I remember things I did yesterday if there isn't a continuous I that experienced them and is now remembering them?
Good question. And the fifth. Fifth is about agency. distinguishing the agent who acts from the object, what is acted upon. If the self is just the aggregates, who is doing the thinking, the acting? Who experiences the results? It seems to blur that line.
Those are definitely some weighty objections. They touch on things we take for granted. Responsibility, continuity, experience. How does Chandrakirti respond?
His response hinges on that crucial distinction between the two truths, ultimate truth and conventional truth.
Right, the two levels of reality.
Exactly. He argues that while ultimately, from the perspective of that deep sevenfold analysis, the self lacks inherent existence, conventionally, it absolutely exists and functions.
So karma, memory, agency, they all work on that conventional level.
Yes. They operate perfectly well within the framework of conventional reality, even though the self involved isn't ultimately inherently real. Emptiness doesn't destroy conventional reality, it just describes its ultimate nature. He argues that these objections don't actually undermine the Madhyamaka view once you understand this two-truth framework properly.
Okay, that provides a good framework for understanding the Madhyamaka position. Let's pivot now. How does Advaita Vedanta approach these questions about self and reality? It sounds quite different.
It is quite different, yes. The central concept in Advaita Vedanta, which literally means non-duality, is Brahman.
Brahman, the ultimate reality.
Yes, the single, indivisible, ultimate reality. Brahman is described as the absolute, as pure consciousness, Sat Chidananda, being consciousness bliss. It's the very ground of all existence, without any internal divisions or attributes.
And the individual self, the Atman. Where does that fit in?
This is the core teaching. Atman is Brahman. Your innermost self, your true essence, is identical to that ultimate non-dual reality.
So the feeling of being a separate individual?
Yes. That's considered ultimately illusory, a product of ignorance or avidya. In its true nature, the Atman isn't separate from Brahman at all.
The text mentions analyzing the three states of experience, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, as a way Vedanta points to this. How does that work?
Right, that's a classic Vedantic analysis. They look at these states to reveal the underlying, unchanging consciousness, the Atman.
So in waking,
we experience the external world, our body, our mind as an individual, separate entity.
Then in dreaming,
the external world disappears. We experience a purely subjective world created by the mind. The sense of I, the dreamer, is still there, but the context changes dramatically.
And deep, dreamless sleep.
Here, even the dream world and the sense of the individual I seem to vanish. Yet Vedanta argues there's still consciousness. We know we slept soundly, peacefully. There wasn't nothing. There was an experience of undifferentiated consciousness, of bliss, even if unremembered specifically.
So the argument is that something remains constant through all three states.
Exactly. The consciousness that witnesses waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, that underlying awareness, is the unchanging Atman. It's the screen on which the movies of waking and dreaming play out. And it remains even when the screen is blank in deep sleep.
And there's also this idea of the five sheaths, the koshas. How do they fit in?
The koshas are like layers obscuring the Atman. Advaita describes 5 sheaths, starting from the outermost, the physical body, Annamaya kosha, moving inwards through the energy body, mental body, intellectual body, to the innermost sheath of bliss, Anandamaya kosha.
Like layers of an onion around the core.
That's a good analogy. We mistakenly identify with these layers. I am my body, I am my thoughts, I am my feelings. Vedanta says we need to discriminate, to see these are coverings, not the true self, the Atman, which lies beyond them, identical to Brahman.
Okay, so putting the two side by side. Madhyamaka says the self is conventionally real, but ultimately empty of inherent existence. Advaita says the apparent individual self is ultimately an illusion, Maya, and the true self, Atman, is the ultimate reality, Brahman.
That captures the core difference pretty well. It's a significant divergence in their ultimate view.
And Shankara, the main proponent of Vedanta, he had arguments for this non-duality.
Yes, Shankara emphasized that unchanging witness consciousness. He argued that awareness itself doesn't change, even as the objects of awareness, thoughts, feelings, perceptions, constantly change. That unchanging witness, he said, must be the ultimate reality, Brahman.
And that brings us to Maya, this concept of illusion.
Right. Maya is the power, often described as inexplicable, that makes the one non-dual Brahman appear as the diverse universe, the seemingly separate individuals. It's like the power that makes us see a rope as a snake in dim light. The snake, the world of multiplicity, isn't ultimately real, only the rope, Brahman, is.
So Maya both conceals the true reality of Brahman and projects the appearance of the world.
Exactly. It's the principle of apparent differentiation. From the standpoint of Brahman, the ultimate reality, there is no Maya, no multiplicity. It only appears from our limited individual perspective.
Which means that liberation, moksha in Advaita is what exactly?
It's the direct realization, the experiential knowing of that identity. Atman is Brahman. Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman. It's not about becoming Brahman because you already are Brahman. It's about removing the ignorance, avidya, that hides that truth.
So dissolving that illusion of being a separate, limited individual.
Precisely. That realization brings an end to the cycle of rebirth and suffering, which is rooted in that sense of separateness.
Now, the text mentions that Advaitins sometimes look at the Buddhist idea of emptiness and worry it's nihilistic.
Yes, that's a common critique from the Advaita side. They sometimes express concern that if everything is empty, including any ultimate ground like Brahman, then what's the basis for anything? Does it lead to a denial of all reality, making ethics or spiritual practice pointless? A sort of nothing matters conclusion?
And they use analogies to illustrate their own view, like gold and ornaments.
Right. That's a classic Advaita analogy. Brahman is like the gold, the underlying substance. The world, with all its different forms and names, people, trees, pots, pans, are like different ornaments made from that gold.
A ring, a necklace?
Exactly. They look different, have different functions, different names, but their essential reality, their substance, is just gold. Similarly, all the diversity we see is just Brahman appearing under different names and forms due to Maya. The reality is one, the appearances are many, but the appearances don't have a separate reality from the substance.
Okay, so we have these two really sophisticated, powerful systems, but they arrive at conclusions about the ultimate nature of things that seem, on the surface at least, quite opposed.
Radically different conclusions about the ultimate, yes.
But are there places where they might perhaps find some common ground? Any points of convergence?
Well, despite the stark difference in the final analysis, you could argue there's overlap in their critiques. Both systems strongly challenge the naive, everyday view of a permanent, independent, inherently existing self.
So they both agree that our usual idea of me is problematic.
Yes, they both see that clinging to such a self is a fundamental source of suffering and delusion. They both offer paths to deconstruct that flawed view of selfhood. That's a significant shared starting point, in a way.
But their ultimate destinations are different. Madhyamaka lands on emptiness. The lack of inherent existence is the final truth. Advaita lands on Brahman, pure, non-dual consciousness, as the ultimate reality.
Exactly. Madhyamaka analysis keeps deconstructing until even the idea of an ultimate positive reality is seen as empty. Advaita posits Brahman as that positive ultimate ground, even if it's beyond concepts and attributes.
And we mentioned the Advaitin concern about Madhyamaka potentially leading to nihilism or undermining conventional reality. How does Chandrakirti, from the Madhyamaka side, address the Advaita view? Does he have critiques?
Oh, yes. Chandrakirti doesn't just present his view, he actively argues against competing views, including those that resemble Advaita Vedanta. He essentially turns the Madhyamaka analytical method back onto the Advaitin concept of Atman Brahman.
Using the same kind of logic as the Chariot analogy.
Pretty much, yes. He applies that same sevenfold reasoning to the idea of a permanent, unchanging, partless Atman or Brahman. He asks, is this Atman the same as consciousness? Is it different? Does it possess consciousness? And so on. He argues that even this concept of an ultimate unchanging self faces logical inconsistencies when subjected to rigorous analysis.
So he's questioning the inherent existence of the Advaitin ultimate reality itself.
Exactly. He's pushing the emptiness analysis all the way. Furthermore, Chandrakirti highlights a methodological difference.
Which is?
He points out that Advaita Vedanta relies quite heavily on scripture, the Upanishads, as a primary source of knowledge, pramana, about Brahman. It's taken as authoritative testimony revealing that ultimate reality.
Whereas Madhyamaka emphasizes.
Madhyamaka puts a much stronger emphasis on logical reasoning, pramana of inference, and direct analytical meditation as the primary tools to understand the ultimate nature of reality, which is emptiness. They are generally more skeptical of relying solely on scriptural claims for ultimate truths, preferring analysis.
And flipping it back again from the Advaitin perspective, what's the main concern about the Buddhist view, particularly the denial of a permanent self?
The core worry is about continuity and grounding. If there's no permanent underlying self, Atman, what provides the basis for moral responsibility across lifetimes? What is it that carries karma? What is it that actually attains liberation or enlightenment if the person is just a constantly changing stream of aggregates?
They feel you need that stable substrate, the Atman, for those concepts to make sense.
Yes, they argue that the unchanging witness, the Atman, provides that necessary continuity for karma, rebirth, memory, and ultimately for liberation to be a meaningful concept for an enduring entity.
Wow. It really lays bare how these two traditions grapple with the absolute bedrock questions of existence, consciousness, and suffering. Fascinating to see the points of contact and the sharp divergences.
It really is. And the sophistication of the arguments on both sides is just incredible. Despite the differences, both offer these profound paths aimed at transcending suffering and ignorance, even if the description of the goal and the methods differ significantly.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. To bring our deep dive together, we've explored Chandrakirti's Madhyamaka view, this radical idea that everything, including ourself, is empty of inherent existence. We saw how the chariot analogy is used to dismantle our assumptions through logic.
Right. And then we looked at Advaita Vedanta, which posits Brahman, non-dual consciousness, as the ultimate reality, and says our true self, the Atman, is actually identical to that. The apparent separation is due to Maya, or illusion.
We touched on the key differences, emptiness versus a positive absolute, the role of logic versus scripture, and the critiques each level against the other regarding nihilism or the need for a permanent self.
And we noted that shared critique of the ordinary egoic self as a source of suffering.
And it's just really cool to remember the origin story here. Swami Sarvapriyananda's paper, born from that intense back and forth at Harvard Divinity School. Professor Garfield pushing for pure logic, not a temple talk.
Yeah, that insistence on arguing both sides logically, rigorously. It really highlights the value of that kind of critical examination when dealing with such profound questions. That essay now in his book really captures that spirit.
Absolutely. And these ancient debates, they're not just historical curiosities, are they? They feel incredibly relevant for understanding ourselves, consciousness, our place in the cosmos, even today.
They absolutely do. They force us to question our deepest assumptions.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to take away from this. Thinking about these perspectives, Chandrakirti's emptiness, Advaita's non-dual Brahman, what does the idea of self really mean to you personally? Is it empty? Is it part of a larger whole? And how might reflecting on that impact how you actually experience the world day to day? Definitely something to chew on. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.